It was the kind of night that felt stitched together from old memories, quiet, cold, and full of the kind of silence that wraps around you like a wool blanket. Snow blanketed the open land in Laramie, Wyoming, covering the fences and frozen fields like a secret waiting to be kept. The stars above blinked steadily through the clear winter sky, and the wind whistled gently through the pine trees behind the Sullivan farmhouse, the same trees that had stood guard for over 3 generations. The farmhouse itself, a sturdy wooden structure built by Charlie's father in the 1950s, leaned just a little to one side but held strong like the people inside it. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows, casting soft shadows across the snow-covered porch where a wind chime swayed and clinked with each breeze, playing its faint metal lullaby to the night. Inside, the ticking of an old pendulum clock marked time as if life here moved slower, more deliberately, like it always had. Martha Sullivan, 68, moved about the modest kitchen in her thick woolen socks and a plaid apron that had seen better years. Her gray bob framed a round, gentle face, lined by time but still quick to smile, especially when scolding the cookies she claimed always burned themselves out of spite. The smell of cinnamon and brown sugar lingered in the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of pine that drifted in through the gaps in the old wood frame. Her husband, Charlie, 2 years her senior and just as stubborn as he was kind, sat nearby in a creaky recliner by the wood stove, poking at the logs with a fire iron he'd had since his ranger days. He wore a thick cardigan over a denim shirt, his strong hands, once capable of felling trees in the national parks, now steadying a crossword puzzle on his lap, pencil in hand. They had the ease of a couple who had weathered both storms and stillness together. Occasionally, one would speak, and the other would reply without looking up, 2 people who knew each other so well that silence wasn't absence, just comfort. That evening had been like most winter evenings on the prairie. The roads were quiet, the neighbors miles apart, and the only sounds came from the crackling of the fire, the distant howl of coyotes, and the low hum of the wind brushing against the windows. The world felt far away out here, as if the troubles of modern life couldn't quite reach them. It was the kind of place where you didn't bother locking your doors until spring, and you still left soup on the porch for the delivery driver. But even in such peaceful places, life had a way of shifting in the dark, and that night, though it started like any other, would become one they would never forget. Rufus was not the kind of dog you saw in magazines or glossy calendars. He didn't have the polished sheen of a show animal or the obedient stiffness of a well-trained retriever. No, Rufus was a hound of character, bred from the hearty mix of bloodhound and Labrador, and it showed in every part of him, from his long, drooping ears that sometimes dipped into his water bowl, to his wide, soulful eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. His coat was a rustic mix of tan and brown, mottled like the bark of an old tree, and his nose, larger than most, seemed always on alert, twitching at the faintest scent in the wind. At 8 years old, Rufus had settled into a rhythm that fit the Sullivan house like a hand in a worn glove. By day, he was gentle and slow-moving, content to follow Martha from room to room like a shadow with 4 legs. He'd rest his chin on her lap during tea, or curl up by the hearth with a groan that seemed to say, "It's been a long life, ma'am." Charlie swore the dog could understand full sentences, and he might have been right. Rufus was not one to bark unnecessarily, nor did he bother chasing the rabbits that danced through the yard. He was watchful, patient, more guardian than pet. But at night, something in him shifted. As if called by instinct older than memory, Rufus would do his rounds. After the last log was placed on the fire and the lights dimmed, he would rise slowly and patrol the house, his heavy paws patting softly on the wooden floorboards. He'd sniff each window, sit by the back door for a spell, and eventually settle himself at the door of the nursery, where little Grace lay sleeping. Grace was Martha and Charlie's granddaughter, a sweet, golden-haired 18-month-old girl with curious eyes and a laugh that could melt the frost off the window panes. Their daughter, Mary, a reservist deployed overseas, had left Grace in their care, trusting the quiet strength of her parents and the quiet watch of Rufus. From the moment Grace arrived, Rufus attached himself to her like moss on stone. He would lay beneath her high chair during meals, catching bits of biscuit and peas, but never demanding. When she cried, he'd nose at her door or whimper gently, and when she slept, he stood guard. They had a quiet understanding. Grace would reach for his ear or fur, babbling her baby words, and Rufus would let her, his tail thumping gently in reply. No one had taught him to protect her. He simply knew. Charlie often joked that Rufus was more reliable than any alarm system, and Martha had once caught him sleeping beside Grace's crib, one eye open, as if daring the shadows to come any closer. He was their companion, their sentinel, and though he had never once had to prove his courage, there was no doubt in either of their minds that if danger ever came, Rufus would be the one to stand between it and the child he had silently claimed as his own. It began as an ordinary morning, the kind that slipped gently into memory like so many others. The sun rose late over Laramie that time of year, casting a pale light across the snow-covered fields. Martha was already up, her hands kneading dough on the kitchen counter, the scent of yeast and rising flour mingling with fresh coffee. Charlie sat at the kitchen table squinting at the newspaper, mumbling half-hearted complaints about the crossword being too easy today, though it was likely he'd been stuck on the same clue for 10 minutes. Grace babbled softly in her playpen near the window, stacking blocks and knocking them over with the same delight each time. And Rufus lay sprawled across the braided rug in front of the stove, his belly rising and falling in a steady rhythm that matched the calm of the morning. But even in that stillness, something was off. Martha first noticed it when she opened the back door to shake out the kitchen rug. Rufus, who normally paid such things little mind, bolted upright and growled low in his throat. His hackles lifted, not with playfulness, but with unease. She paused, looking out across the yard. Nothing seemed amiss. The trees stood motionless in the cold, the snow unbroken except for the usual rabbit tracks and the small impressions of Rufus's patrol the night before. "You all right, old boy?" she asked, rubbing his head. Rufus didn't take his eyes off the tree line. He didn't bark, just stared, ears forward, tail stiff. That afternoon, when Charlie returned from a quick run into town, he found Rufus waiting at the gate, not on the porch as usual. The dog paced and sniffed around the fence line, moving with a sense of purpose that Charlie hadn't seen in years. "Reckon he smells a fox," Charlie muttered, unloading a sack of grain from the truck bed. But even he could tell Rufus wasn't just chasing a scent, he was tracking something. That evening, while Grace napped in the nursery upstairs and the house settled into its early dusk. Quiet, Rufus refused to rest. He paced the hallway just outside her room, ears twitching, nose to the floor, then to the air. When Martha tried to coax him downstairs with a treat, he ignored her, something he had never done in all his years of living under that roof. As night fell, Rufus let out a bark, just one, deep and loud, from somewhere near the kitchen door. It was sharp enough to make Charlie look up from his book and Martha glance toward the window. "He's never barked like that before," she whispered. Charlie nodded, quietly setting down his mug. They didn't say it aloud, but both felt it, that strange, unspoken warning that settled heavy in the chest. Outside, the snow fell soft and quiet. Inside, the warmth of the fire seemed suddenly fragile, like something that needed watching. Rufus returned to his post outside Grace's door, his eyes open, his body still. And the night crept on. The next morning brought with it a brittle kind of cold, the kind that made the windows fog from within and left the front porch covered in a thin crust of ice. Charlie stepped out just after sunrise, rubbing his hands together and muttering about how his bones weren't built for this kind of winter anymore. Rufus padded behind him, nose to the wind again, sniffing the air with focused intensity. Martha stood at the sink, watching the two of them through the frosty windowpane as she washed dishes from breakfast. Something about the way Rufus moved made her uneasy. He wasn't meandering the yard like usual. He was scanning, alert. "That dog's got a sixth sense, I swear it," she said aloud, though only the ticking clock answered. Later that afternoon, Martha bundled Grace in her thickest coat and took her for a short walk down the main gravel road that curved through their stretch of countryside. The mailbox stood half a mile away, near the old ranger trail Charlie used to walk during his working years. As they reached the turn, Martha saw her neighbor Edna Hargrove pulling in her driveway in that old blue pickup that coughed more than it ran. Edna was sharp as a tack at 72, full of stories and warnings, some useful, some half-spun, but today, her brow was furrowed in a way Martha hadn't seen before. "You be careful walkin' out here, Martha," Edna called out, leaning out her window. "Sheriff stopped by this mornin'. Said there's been someone seen hanging around the far side of the woods. Man in dark clothes, not from around here. Haven't caught him yet." Martha felt her stomach tighten. "Did they say what he was doing?" Edna shook her head. "Just watching. Standing near the old hunting posts. No reason to be there this time of year." Grace kicked her boots in the stroller, oblivious, humming to herself. Rufus, who had followed quietly behind, stopped in his tracks and stared down the bend in the road. His ears perked, body tense, and he let out a quiet whine, not loud, but troubled. Martha reached instinctively for Grace's stroller and began pushing back toward the house, nodding a goodbye to Edna. That evening, the house felt different. Not unsafe exactly, but less sure. Charlie double-checked the locks, a habit he'd never needed before in Laramie, and placed the shotgun by the coat rack, out of sight but close enough. "Just in case," he said softly, not meeting Martha's eyes. Rufus had begun a new pattern. At exactly 2 in the morning, he would rise, walk to the front door, and stare out the glass pane, nose twitching, unmoving. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just waited. Martha tried peering out the window beside him once, but saw nothing, only the wide expanse of snow and the dark outline of pine trees against the moonlight. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. And Rufus knew it. The storm rolled in without much warning, as they often did that time of year. By early evening, the wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the old farmhouse walls and rattling the shutters with the kind of persistence that made sleep feel like a distant promise. The power flickered once during supper and then again when Martha was washing dishes. Charlie fetched the old oil lantern from the pantry, setting it on the kitchen table like an old friend come to visit. "Just in case," he said, though his voice carried a weight it hadn't the day before. Outside, the snow fell in dense, slanted sheets, and the landscape disappeared behind the swirling white. The world beyond the house seemed to vanish altogether. Upstairs, Grace had been tucked in early, her cheeks rosy from the dry heat and her little fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. The monitor sat on the nightstand, its faint static humming in the background. Rufus lay as he had every night, stationed near the door of the nursery, but this time his ears twitched with each gust of wind, and his eyes remained open, tracking shadows that danced along the hallway walls. Martha paused at the top of the stairs, watching him. "You sure are on edge tonight," she murmured. Rufus didn't move. He stared, head low, body still. It was close to midnight when the first sound came, not loud, but wrong. Charlie had just dozed off in his chair by the fire when Rufus rose without a sound and padded quickly downstairs. Martha, reading in bed, heard the soft creak of the boards and the faint click of Rufus's nails. She sat up, alert, her book falling shut in her lap. Downstairs, the house groaned as the wind pressed hard against the walls, but then came another sound, metal against wood, subtle but distinct. The back door. The latch, long in need of repair, sometimes gave in heavy weather, but this wasn't that. Rufus's growl was low and deep, vibrating through the floorboards. Martha reached for the bedside lamp, but the light didn't come. The power had finally gone. She called Charlie's name, her voice barely above a whisper, but the only answer was the creaking of the stairs. Someone, or something, was moving inside the house. In the dark, the monitor snapped from static to silence. No sound from Grace's room. No breathing, no rustling. Just nothing. Rufus moved like a shadow, down the hallway, nose to the ground, body taut with purpose. He stopped at the base of the stairs and looked up, ears angled forward. Then, in the pitch silence of the winter storm, came the faintest creak of the nursery door being pushed open. Martha's breath caught as she stepped into the hall. A figure, cloaked in black, crept up the staircase with deliberate care. He moved low, with a cloth bag in one hand and gloves covering his fingers. But he didn't know Rufus had been watching him long before he ever crossed the threshold. The old hound's body tensed, and his eyes locked on the intruder. The time had come. The watchful guardian was ready. Rufus didn't bark. He didn't growl. He moved like mist, low to the floor, silent, sure. Every muscle in his body was poised, every instinct sharpened to a razor's edge. The intruder reached the top of the staircase, unaware of the eyes that had tracked him from the moment he stepped through the back door. The house was silent, but not still. It was holding its breath. The man's footsteps were measured, careful not to creak the old boards beneath him. In one gloved hand, he held a flashlight, kept low and shielded to avoid detection. In the other, a canvas sack, its shape vague, but its purpose chillingly clear. He crept down the hall, slowly reaching for the nursery door. The monitor had gone dead downstairs, the baby silent in her sleep, and the snow outside muffled everything like a shroud. He had no idea he was being hunted. Just as he touched the doorknob, Rufus struck. From the shadows, the old dog launched forward, his body surging with a strength that seemed to come from some place far beyond flesh and bone. There was no hesitation, no warning, just the crack of the intruder's body slamming against the hallway wall as Rufus collided with him, knocking the flashlight from his grip. It clattered across the floor, spinning a wide beam of chaotic light as the man crashed backward, gasping in shock. He hadn't seen it coming. Martha, still frozen halfway down the hall, stifled a cry, hand over her mouth. Charlie, woken by the thud, had leapt from his chair and was rushing up the stairs in stocking feet, heart pounding like a drum. But Rufus needed no help. The man tried to scramble up, but Rufus was on him again, growling now, low and guttural, his body over the intruder's chest, teeth bared just inches from the man's face. The would-be kidnapper froze, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with panic. He raised a hand slowly, as if to fend off the dog, but Rufus pressed forward, a silent threat, "Move, and you won't like what comes next." Then came the baby's voice. Soft, barely a whisper in the quiet. "Woof woof?" It came from the nursery, confused, half asleep. The man jerked toward the sound. That was his mistake. Rufus lunged again, this time catching the man's jacket in his jaws and yanking him hard to the floor, pinning him once more. By the time Charlie reached the hallway, flashlight in hand and shotgun slung across his shoulder, Rufus had the man cornered, growling low and steady, as if daring anyone else to try something so foolish again. Charlie took one look at the scene, his voice steady but fierce. "Don't you move. Not one damn inch." Martha appeared behind him, her hands trembling, tears in her eyes. But Rufus was still and watchful, his body pressed firm against the stranger on the floor. The guardian had done his duty. And the child had never even stirred. The flashing blue and red lights lit up the snow like firecrackers in the night. By the time Sheriff Cole's cruiser pulled into the long gravel drive, the storm had begun to ease, leaving behind a quiet so sharp it rang in the ears. The farmhouse, still glowing faintly with lantern light, looked peaceful from the outside, unchanged, as if none of it had happened. But inside, something had shifted forever. Charlie met the sheriff at the door, his face pale but resolute. "He's in the hallway," he said simply, stepping aside. Rufus still sat beside the man, unmoving, his chest rising slowly, his eyes never leaving the intruder. It wasn't rage that filled the room, but something more chilling: certainty. The kind of knowing that comes only when instinct is finally proven right. The man on the floor looked younger than expected, mid-30s, wiry, with dirt beneath his nails and a look in his eyes that hovered somewhere between panic and defiance. Sheriff Cole knelt beside him, his gloved hand reaching for the man's wallet. The silence stretched thin as he flipped it open, his brows knitting as he read the ID. Jason Murdoch, the sheriff muttered, more to himself than anyone. Then louder, to the room, he's wanted. 2 counties over. Disappeared 6 months ago after attempting to break into a family home in Sheridan. Similar setup. Quiet house, baby inside. Only that time, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Charlie clenched his jaw, and Martha, standing just behind him, let out a small gasp, her hand tightening around the edge of the stair rail. Rufus let out a soft, grumbling growl, as if in response. The sheriff turned to the old dog with a look of something between gratitude and awe. If it weren't for him, he paused. This could have been a different call. Charlie knelt beside Rufus, scratching behind his ear with shaking fingers. He knew. Days before, he knew. Rufus blinked slowly, as if to say, "Of course I did." Grace stirred in her crib upstairs, her small voice calling out, "Woof woof," as if sensing the house had come alive. Martha moved to check on her, her legs feeling strangely heavy as she climbed the stairs. She reached the nursery and found Grace sitting up, blinking sleepily. She wrapped her in a warm blanket and held her close, the child's tiny heartbeat a reminder of everything that could have been lost. Downstairs, Sheriff Cole read Murdoch his rights while deputies secured the house. The snow had begun to fall again, light this time, barely more than a whisper. But something was different now. The illusion of safety that comes with distance had been cracked, replaced by a deeper, more lasting kind of awareness. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and something older, something watchful. Inside, Rufus lay down by the fire, his job done for now, but his ears still twitching. The stranger was gone, the danger past. But the story, the truth of it all, was only just beginning to settle in. The morning came slowly, with a sky the color of ash and the air sharp with cold. Snow had settled softly over the footprints and tire tracks that marked the long driveway, as if trying to erase the memory of the night before. But inside the Sullivan farmhouse, the memory lingered, heavy and real, stitched into the quiet moments between coffee sips and glances out the window. Nothing had been broken, no one had been physically hurt, yet the sense of violation ran deep. Deeper still was the gratitude that it hadn't ended differently. And at the center of that gratitude stood Rufus. He didn't act any differently that next morning. He moved through the house with his usual slow gait, curling up by the wood stove and letting out a soft groan as he stretched out his legs. But wherever he went, eyes followed him with a kind of reverence. Charlie poured his coffee slower that day, his hand lingering on Rufus's head as he passed. Martha, who'd always spoken to the dog as if he were a half-listening house guest, now whispered to him with a tenderness usually reserved for prayer. Word spread quickly. In a town like Laramie, you didn't need a newspaper for stories to travel. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Cole had called in a formal statement, and within hours, the tale was already circling through the grocery store aisles and over the post office counter. That old hound saved that baby, folks said, nodding solemnly. Waited and watched like he knew it all along. Later that week, a small piece ran in the county paper, nothing flashy, just a photograph of Rufus sitting on the porch, the headline reading, "Hometown Hero Foils Midnight Intruder." Martha clipped it carefully and pinned it to the refrigerator beside Grace's finger paintings. Charlie joked about needing to install a plaque above Rufus's favorite spot by the hearth. Or maybe a badge, he mused, Deputy Dog. The local hardware store dropped off a custom doghouse, hand-built and lined with wool insulation. The church ladies brought fresh-baked biscuits, for the real hero, they said, laughing gently as they handed over a basket tied with ribbon. Even the town vet, who usually only saw Rufus once a year for his rabies shot, came by with a new collar, thick leather, brass tag, engraved with one word, Guardian. But Rufus took none of it with pride or confusion. He accepted it all the same way he did everything, with quiet eyes and steady breath. He didn't seem to understand that he'd done something remarkable. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't think it needed to be celebrated. That evening, as the fire crackled and Grace giggled in her playpen, Rufus lay nearby, eyes half closed, tail thumping lazily. Martha looked over at him and smiled. "He's not just a dog," she said softly, more to herself than anyone. Charlie nodded. "No," he agreed. "He's family. And he always was." The house felt safer now, not just because the danger had passed, but because it had been faced and beaten by love wrapped in fur and 4 legs. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one not born out of fear, but out of deeper appreciation. Life in Laramie didn't change on the surface, the roads were still half-plowed and the general store still closed early on Sundays. But inside the Sullivan farmhouse, and within the hearts of those who had heard the story, something had shifted. There was a quiet hum of connection now, a reminder that in a world often indifferent, acts of loyalty and love still meant something. Especially when they came from unexpected places. Neighbors began to stop by more often. Some brought baked goods, others brought stories of their own dogs, tales they hadn't told in years. There was a shared sense of pride that Rufus, the old mutt everyone knew by sight but not by name, had done something truly extraordinary. The children at the small-town elementary school made drawings of Rufus, some with capes, others with shiny gold medals around his neck. One even drew him with a sheriff's hat. Miss Bramble, the school librarian, sent over a handwritten letter inviting the Sullivans and Rufus to come speak at their storytime hour. "The children want to meet a real-life hero," she wrote in careful script. Charlie chuckled when he read it. "Imagine that," he said, scratching Rufus behind the ear. "You've become a celebrity, boy. Might have to start charging for paw prints." Martha smiled, though there were tears in her eyes too, the kind that come not from sadness, but from the deep relief that swells after something nearly lost has been returned. She often found herself watching Grace more closely now, even when the baby was simply stacking blocks or babbling nonsense to her stuffed bear. There was something more sacred about those ordinary moments, as if each one had been granted extra weight, more meaning. Rufus had returned to his quiet watch. Each evening, he would take his place by the nursery door, eyes half closed, tail tapping occasionally against the floor. But now, instead of just being part of the background, every creak of the floor under his paws felt significant. Every glance he gave toward the woods carried history. He wasn't just a companion anymore, he was the keeper of the house's peace. One evening, Sheriff Cole stopped by with a small plaque carved from pine. "Just a token," he said, placing it on the fireplace mantel. It read, "To Rufus, for duty, loyalty, and heart." The sheriff stood for a moment, his hand resting on the dog's broad head, then nodded once and left. As the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring whispered through the pines, Martha found herself sitting on the porch more often, Grace in her lap and Rufus at her feet. The wind still carried stories through the valley, but now, one of those stories belonged to them. A story of watchfulness, of trust, and of the bond between a family and the dog who never stopped guarding their door. As winter gave way to early spring, the Sullivans found themselves reflecting more often, not just on what had happened, but on what it meant. Life had returned to its usual pace, the kind marked by small routines and familiar comforts. But even in the quiet moments, something deeper lingered in their hearts. The events of that stormy night had left an imprint, not just in memory, but in the way they now viewed the world. In particular, it reshaped how they understood the quiet loyalty that had always been present in the form of one aging dog with tired eyes and a faithful heart. Charlie spoke of it often, not in dramatic terms, but in passing remarks while feeding the chickens or fixing the gate. "Funny how we talk about instincts like they're only for us," he'd say, glancing down at Rufus who trailed beside him. "That dog knew what was coming before any of us did." Martha, ever more contemplative, would nod in agreement, her thoughts often drifting back to the moment she saw Rufus standing guard at Grace's door, unflinching and alert. It was not aggression that had driven him, but something far deeper, intuition. A sense of knowing, of protection, of love that needed no language. The townsfolk often marveled at Rufus's courage, but the Sullivans saw it differently. They didn't see it as a miracle or even an act of heroism. They saw it as the natural extension of a bond that had been nurtured quietly over years. They had fed him, walked him, spoken to him in the soft hours of the morning when the world was still asleep. And in return, Rufus had watched them, listened to them, and loved them without condition. That night, he hadn't acted out of fear or training. He had acted out of duty, born not from command, but from connection. There was a lesson in that, one that settled into Charlie's bones and took root in Martha's heart. It was the reminder that sometimes the truest form of loyalty doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the silent, everyday acts of love. That real guardianship is not about barking at every shadow, but knowing which shadow carries danger. And that animals, far from being just companions, often carry a wisdom we too easily overlook. Grace would grow up hearing the story of that night, of the dark-clad man and the brave old dog. She wouldn't remember it firsthand, but it would become part of her family's lore. And every time she looked at the photograph of Rufus on the mantel or read the plaque Sheriff Cole had left behind, she would know what her grandparents already believed in their bones, that love, in its truest form, watches over us when we sleep, stands between us and danger, and sometimes, walks on four legs. Because in the end, it wasn't just a story about a dog stopping a stranger. It was about never underestimating the quiet ones, the steady ones, the ones who simply stay.